Hello and welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. I'm Bruce Gemmel. This is episode 25, Beauty, following up on my work last week in terms of truth. So this is episode 25, a series of ruminations about my thinking, about my thoughts, about my architectural research, and my ideas in general. It's probably going to be some kind of follow-up to this project. This is kind of like a retelling of a series of things that I talked about in a previous platform that basically was something that didn't cooperate properly, and as a result I kind of redid them. In the process of redoing them, I basically was kind of true to the format of the first group, and as a result now I'm kind of getting to the point where I've recounted and redone them, so now they kind of exist here on YouTube. And then with, I think, the last one that's going to basically be a retelling is next one, which will be Love, which is a correlate of truth and beauty. And basically from then I'll go back to some other ideas that'll kind of extend. And I was thinking about the next pieces. So basically after truth will be entanglement and conditioning, measurements, and then the nature of perspective within the metaphor. And then there's a series of pieces after that. Talk about consequence, value, and some of the kind of lexicon that I've talked about in my work. So last week we talked about truth. We talked about these things as constituents or potential occasions for civilization. We've kind of made an analogy between the idea of the accretion of the metaphorical operation and found parallels in the works of Whitehead, and kind of trying to basically kind of pull these things together. We started with the operation of the metaphor, and then from there we kind of talked about various different things in terms of my work as an architect, my own experience, how I got to where I was. Then from there, let's see. Let's go back. Let's go look at the notes. Operation of the metaphor, the organic metaphor. So what I talked about was the fact that there was an organic and there was an artificial. Most of us understand the artificial metaphor, and we understand that through a misconception about the fact that we believe that it originates in language, when it actually originates as a natural process of ordering. And, we understand it only because we discovered from a process in nature, from a kind of complication or a kind of an accretion of sophistication from a kind of degree or a situation of more greater simplicity. Then we talked about the value and necessity of criticism. We talked about what needs to be said, the view of criticism and indicator of societal health. And then introduced the idea of architecture as a verb, drawing. And architecture, I'd say now, and I kind of had that idea like probably since my student days, and then certainly into my kind of professorship days. I now believe that architecture is a process. And I kind of basically come to the fact that it's a stable circumstance. It's basically networked in with other things. But I still kind of see it as an action rather than a noun. I think that there's kind of like, certainly in terms of my thinking, you can see an expression of architecture, but basically the idea of the architecture is an active thing. Talked about an organic architecture, which is something I kind of started talking about back in the probably late 80s, early 90s. And then let's see what else. We talked about authority and ideas. Talked about my past architecture, recent, aftermath. That was basically the kind of going through my particular experience, my particular growth. Then some of the ideas that kind of happened after those things, after kind of getting out of school and after being a professor, going to Russia in 1990, coming back, being one of the first American architects to basically see behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, which was an interesting cultural experience. I think it made me appreciate not just some of the things about the society in which I live in the United States, but also understanding the nature of the United States in terms of like my admiration for Frank Lloyd Wright and Usonian architectural and kind of like democratic structures that basically underpin the way in which we can approach architecture here, which is kind of fairly unique, which gives us some great opportunities. Talked about emotional attachment ideas, understanding and judgment. And then we talked about unbreakable bonds specifically because we find that this is a creation, I think, that indicates something that we talked about in the metaphor. We have the natural metaphor, the organic, the artificial metaphor, and then we have what I call unbreakable bonds, which is kind of societal metaphor, which basically is an indicator of certain things that exist that come together to form a useful cohesion to allow us to kind of move forward. We talked about the idea of an example. We talked about the idea that if we look back um, and we have been able to kind of say, if we merge technique or traditions with reason, right, this unbreakable bond has served us very well over the past 500 years. And we talk about the fact that this is something that allowed us to make certain traumatic technological advances, as well as kind of moral, as well as giving us kind of like moral understanding of certain things as good or bad. So we realize that you don't sacrifice virgins in order to get rain. There are no such thing as witches. You kind of like can really, you have to suspend the operation of reason and science to come to these kind of like ridiculous and absurd conclusions. And these become the way of giving you a moral component to make decisions about murder and sacrifice and slaughter and cannibalism and ritualistic suicide and ridiculously abhorrent, diabolically evil things. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that we are morally just. We just simply know what things we know are wrong, which we've learned because of this unbreakable bond. Anyway, so going through that, we talked about traditions and cultures. And that brings us to where we are now, which is the idea of what makes for civilization. And I found that reading Alfred North Whitehead, Aims of Education, Adventures of Ideas, and a beautiful book that Julie just got me this week, which was one of these, which is a series of collected essays called Through, oh wait, where was it? I put it here. Where did I put it? I thought I put it there. I have it next to the Aims of Education. Again, Aims of Education was a very influential book on me, and I still see it. No, I kind of know where it is. It's right here. It's called Interpretation of Science, which was actually, it's a beautiful copy. It came from our friends at the Rockefeller University Library, which is a great place, which I love, and I've visited a few times.
And they jettisoned it.
And they got rid of it, which is,
And it's a first
quite sad. It's a first edition. So I mean, it's some other essays that are in other collections, but this is certainly, and it's even like a numbered copy. So it's beautiful. And let me just go quickly through the contents. So the interpretation of science, the philosophy of science, that's part one. And then part two, the relevance of natural science to education and religion. And then part three, metaphysics and the evaluation of natural science. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, let me just kind of say that to me, what is probably the most important contribution by Whitehead is the fact that because of his background, for whatever reason, he was able to kind of look at traditional metaphysical speculation and realize that the quandary that Kant had put us into could be understood, and that this dilemma that we had with immovable substance and kind of like changeable reality could be overcome by understanding that substance, right, was a process, not a thing. And as a result of that, we understood that, what we call ontology in terms of being was actually becoming. So that in terms of the cosmological idea, we had kind of had a difference where we now understood that we are basically in a process of understanding the network and relations of things rather than just a fixed static entity. Now, I mean, this was a huge discovery, and it's still being worked out as it kind of like is, it's 100 years old. But just the same way that we're still kind of working through the realities and the problems of general relativity, we're kind of working through this idea of process. And in fact, it's interesting. I was watching a series of lectures by a guy, John Dupree, who is a philosopher of science and he's basically in this kind of nexus between biology and metaphysics, which is a very exciting place to be right now, especially as an architect, because I see the fact that the idea of what I would call the hermetic, isolated nature of the individual in terms of the architectural environment has been tremendously challenged and needs to continue to be challenged. And I think in order to do that, we have the potential to kind of really strike out at that. So I think that he gave a series of Gifford lectures, which was the same that I believe that Whitehead gave Gifford lectures. I'm not really sure which ones were the ones that, what year it was that came across as process and reality. I believe it was in the 20s, late 20s, maybe early 30s. I could go back and check, but it's around that time. So it's about a generation after general relativity. But again, Whitehead was in conversations and basically spoke about the consequence of these discoveries in physics with Einstein in different debates over time. And I think he came to understand a certain philosophical reality that basically kind of led him into his own investigations into metaphysics. And let's see, one is process and reality. Let's see. I know. Let's see. Whitehead dies in 47, right? Okay. Not important. We'll figure it out. Do I have it here? Yeah. Okay. I have two copies. I have the good copy and I have the bad copy. Don't know where the bad copy is right now. Okay. Not a problem. Anyway, so before we launch into beauty, let's go into our weekly segment, which is What's New in Julie. So, Julie, come and tell us what's new.
Here's what I'm talking about.
Ah.
This is what's new. This is what's new.
Oh, come and show.
Can you hold it and show it?
Yes. Oh, we're going back to this piece. We love this piece.
It is my last finished painting, the one I'm doing now, which is not.
I love this piece.
Are you able? Thank you.
Don't know if I can get far enough back.
Well.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, it's a very long, tall piece, and then zoom in for a close-up on various parts. It's a tall, long piece. And I do work in the way of Chinese scroll paintings, in Japanese scrolls being very vertical, very tall, and very thin, not in the Western canon of that's nice. That's really reads very well. Probably one of my strongest. And you
There's
can read
Nabucco.
the title and the subtitle.
Mm-hmm.
That
Apex
is.
mellifera. Labyrinth of fern proteins.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's Nabucco.
Yes.
All right, there's our Christopher Dresser. Is this this is an Art Nouveau lamp base?
This is actually a piece from an Asprey desk set that won a prize in it's a British piece of malachite and gold-plated bronze from the Asprey Company. And the Asprey Company, unbelievably, from 1857 when it's made, is still in business. And they're still making very fashionable, very exotic home.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, it actually is. They have even a small, posh, very expensive shop on Madison in the 60s. Here, and then you can zoom in on the top.
And then we have the pieces from the oops. We have the pieces from the musical instrument.
Yes, we do.
It basically shows the kind of different tunings that take place.
Of a one singular, one of a kind invented instrument that is part harp, part guitar, part clarinet. It's a one of a kind instrument, and then we see there.
We have the kind of like the honeybees that basically have basically kind of gotten to the point where they have ascended to their circumstance. If you look down here, you can see some of the kind of minions that are kind of basically entangled and entrapped in here. And it's like I love the myth of I love this piece here about Nabucco, and I kind of love his sense of resignation because he was a person who really, God, I've never really figured out how to move these things. No, I'm moving it in reverse.
But it shows up really well.
It does. I love his sense of kind of like resignation that he knows he can't quit, but he knows he's failed. I mean, I love that because I think what's really great is the fact that the malevolent imbecile, right, is a particular individual that we've had to contend with our entire lives.
Oh God.
And as a result,
spades.
Exactly. So what I think was really beautiful about this piece was the fact that you find the way to kind of like understand that the reason that you can find your salvation is that you can find territories that are attainable simply by having a concern and a nurture for those items themselves. And since other people basically are not capable of engaging in the proper conduct, they will constantly be laid waste by the mistakes that they will continue to make by being misled by their own vanity, their own ego, their own, kind of like ignorance, their own frailties. And this is a testament to the fact that, that being honest and being clear, right, allows you access that otherwise gets negated. I mean, Nabucco constantly ends up only ascending the bridge and never basically gets to the point where he can descend to the other side.
Yet he watches all the fern proteins march over the bridge, and he can never attain what something that is microscopic can attain.
Right. So what happens is his own inability to get past his own emotional stumbling blocks and his own frailties is what basically enslaves him to an an endless life in the labyrinth, unable to leave. And all it was our ability to kind of, it was about the fact that we as adventurers, all we ever did was basically pay homage to those portions of the adventure. And I think one of the things I've realized is that the key to innocence, right, is to basically not get emotionally embittered. And
boy, is that hard.
Yeah. And I wrote it down today. Hold this piece for a second. Hold that piece for a second. I wrote it down today, and I think that was kind of like a way in which it was really kind of clear to me, because I was thinking about this. Okay. And it was
one of my favorite pieces.
I love that. You must maintain innocence in spite of experience, so your curiosity and imagination can remain pure. And I think that's the reason why individuals kind of stumble with their realization of the simplest things, and they become distracted, and as a result never see the way for progress. I mean, I'm going to talk about in a couple of weeks, I'm going to talk about the idea of perspective as within, the necessity of perspective within the metaphor, because the point of view that gives you a compelling view is what allows the metaphor to be kind of compelling.
And if you show the upper corner, you can talk about.
You talk about it, because I mean, this is the piece that
corner is a close-up. Yes, I will talk about that in a moment. Thank you. Is a close-up, a scanning electron micrograph of a honeybee eye, and the eye has all of the fine hairs. Each one is covered in glowing green pollen grains, and the eye itself turns into a vast exoplanet. And so the eye is the anchor for all that comes. Everything is hanging from the eye of the honeybees. And my painting shifts rapidly between the microscopic, and the macro. So you have the macroorganisms and a microscopy version of their anatomy, which becomes so beautiful and so much more. And the reason why I chose this for your topic, you will see now, is multifold. So what you see here, right?
I gotta figure out the technology of that.
Is actually a Japanese maki peach incense box, and the box maintains its own. It's a beautiful piece. The maki, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, is a sprinkling of gold on lacquer that's sealed into the layers of lacquer in such a way that it resonates, not a superficial sparkle like glitter or something
Oh,
like that.
okay. Glitter.
Glitter, yeah, not the Brooklyn version,
Mhm.
but has a
Queen's
deep,
version too.
yeah, but
Brooklyn
yes,
and Queen's version.
yes,
Glitter.
glitter,
Glitter. It's also Long Island. Glitter.
yes, but has a glowing gold ochreous heart that just gleams.
Ochreous.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Thank you. And it's a kind of a sparkle, but it's layer on layer. And as you may know, lacquer in the Japanese, very OCD but beautiful tradition of putting down like 40 layers of lacquer gives it a depth that you just would not believe.
Japanese people show that obsessive can have consequences.
Oh, it can have great
one of the things
consequence.
that's really
Oh, a
sad,
cold breeze.
one of the things that's really sad
Yeah.
is that like there's so many neurotic things that are just absolutely with no consequence.
They have no kind.
It's just obsessive. And it's like obsession here. I mean, one of the things I love about the Japanese people is their obsessions are consequential.
It produces some really
does.
beautiful
It's
work.
exactly. And I look at it this way. I'll put up with it if there's a consequence. But I just like listen to someone prattle on about nonsense. It's like, oh my God, please take this person away.
They can pickle vegetables for 3 years. Now that is a pickle of consequence.
Yeah.
So here is why the beauty. No one can stick with Narazuke and pickle it in rice bran for 3 years, but the Japanese can.
Yes.
And they can really turn out a product that is consequential. Okay, so why did I choose this on your topic?
Okay, why did you choose this for our topic?
Yes.
I like that. Actually, what I'm going to do is you know what? Here's what we do. Before we actually do This Week in Julie, let's talk about which piece we're going to show so I can kind of come up with some things to ask you.
Okay.
I love that. Because
great.
Actually, because This Week in Julie has been going on for what, 2 or 3 weeks now?
Yeah,
it's actually like, I would tune in just to see This Week in Julie. I mean, because the rest of it is just, nonsense.
No, it's not. It's meaningful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so why this piece? This is the nature of beauty expressed through the eccentricity of unforeseen character. And that is why people don't think, what is the character of an individual insect? They don't. And in fact, there's a very interesting feature article in Science from a week or two back in the journal Science on the nature of animal consciousness. And this is not a hippy dippy thing. These are real scientific studies on consciousness and not in the fuzzy, adorable animals of the
Disney
mammalian. No, that we expect, like a dog or a cat or a horse or a panda. And how cute are they?
Not a Disney character with James Earl Jones's voice?
Yes, because it's great.
I like James Earl Jones.
No, he was great. Anyway, my point is it's in animals. It's very unexpected. So it's in ants. It's in arthropods. I mean,
Is it in humans?
It's more in crabs than in humans. I doubt a lot of people have consciousness. Anyway, but ants are jealous. I mean, a beetle can feel stress and can act on it. I mean, a spider can feel anxiety and have a memory of something.
And where did we start to imagine these things ourselves? In the work of the great Belgian
Maurice Maeterlinck.
Absolutely. Life of the Bee, Life of the White Ant.
Exactly.
Yep.
It's not a bunch of mindless creatures going through their rote, activities. It's kind of like saying that all plants do is move towards the light. Plants plants mount chemical defenses. They protect other plants. They attack their enemies. They protect animals. Anyway, let me just say.
Yeah.
So the beauty in the nature of the bee is not only the bioarchitecture of the bee's anatomy, but the way light hits the wings, the way the bees actually have fur. And I turned the structure of the bee into a vajra, which you can see up here. And as the bee seeds the beauty of its anatomy, it falls away and becomes another kind of a beauty. an inorganic box that's made in the image of the peach, which is, so it has a beautiful organic model. So as the box reaches its full integrity at the bottom, all of the main structures of the two interlocking honeybees, Apis mellifera. So the title Apex mellifera is a pun on that.
Clever.
Thank you. So, but the beauty of the bees lives in echoes in the lines and the maquille of the box, because as the light hits the bees' eyes, as it hits their wings, so does it live in the lacquer, in the gold work on the box. And the beauty of the insect, of the arthropod exoskeleton, in fact, we had written a scientific article with an expert in arthropods. It was published. That's the one we did with.
Oh, you did that. I had nothing to do with that. That was all yours.
Well, I co-authored a scientific article with a noted entomologist, Randy Mercurio. If you ever hear this, he used to work at the American Museum of Natural History and left to go into construction, sadly, because science pays so well. Yeah, and we had a hypothesis, actually, I did, and I asked him if we could test it, that the properties, the formation of the integrity of man-made lacquer, as in on lacquer writing boxes, lacquer objects, is almost identical in many, many ways to arthropod exoskeletons, in terms of its hydrophobic nature, in terms of its reception to heat, in terms of the layers and its very composition. So the beauty of the structure is very, very similar. Now, as you move down, we explore the beauty of sound in a one-of-a-kind musical instrument that lives in the Hall of Musical Instruments at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a clavichord. It's a one-of-a-kind. It's got valves, so it's sort of like a clarinet. It can be tuned like a guitar. It has strings like a harp, and it's pretty great. So I melded it into this Asprey Company piece, part of a beautiful malachite and gold-plated brass desk set that won this, major award. It's got all sorts of, pieces. It's like a multi-piece set.
One of the things I loved about this was the fact that the base of the lamp was such that you could see the fact that people were distracted. And this was something I enjoy, is the fact that sometimes people's facility and their obsession for facility overtakes the clarity of simplicity. And simplicity is not easy. It's just simply kind of like something that people don't always have the integrity. Well, what happens is the malachite pieces, basically, if I remember correctly, they were the one that basically distracted everyone rather than seeing the very clear marcations for the ascension, which was something that basically stopped. We were able to use that clarity rather than getting obsessed with the facility of technique, right? To be able to kind of like just simply kind of become what we call the Goltzius syndrome, where you kind of like end up kind of like
with like the marshmallow man.
Yes, exactly. So the point is like you kind of over enunciate to the point where it just becomes ridiculous.
So if you want to zoom in really close, I'll point out who is living in the labyrinth. The subtitle of this painting is Labyrinth. Ooh, that's good. Labyrinth of fern proteins. You will see they inhabit this maze.
Right.
And I've turned each malachite cabochon and the bezel into an island. You can picture them as mounds of nature, as fountains, but they are an island, and the maze is actively inhabited by the fern proteins,
which are the individuals that basically don't ascend. So what happens is, as these individuals become trapped because of their own obsessions, they don't see the clear path to progress. And the other thing that was interesting is that, like, what happens is,
Mhm.
one of the things I love about the fact that this bureau, this firm, is
Mhm.
still in production,
It's kind
because
of
there are
amazing.
still places where things of consequence still matter.
Yes.
As opposed to, like, what's interesting is, like, in my particular profession, which is architecture, and I always say, like, architecture is a great field of study, but it's a terrible career.
Oh yeah,
Um,
it really
is that, like, one of the things that's happened
It's
is,
great as a speculist.
no, it
but,
is. I mean,
yeah,
honestly, I kind of love the fact that you can
Yeah.
go off and kind of do research. But
Mhm.
one of the things that's obvious is architecture in general ceased a long time ago making a compelling excuse for its existence, and
Yeah.
as a result, it is about as significant as, say, I don't know, pocket lint. But
Hey, I love pocket
I love
lint.
pocket lint too, and it's fun to play with. The thing is, like,
I have a catalog of pocket lint.
oh, that's good. Yeah, you should probably, we make a kind of like make a catalog.
Hey,
But anyway,
swatches.
like, one of the things I found is that one of the
Yeah.
things that kind of drew me into my own
Mhm.
particular direction was the fact that, like, the places in which people were intrigued
Mhm.
were highly insignificant and lacking in any kind of valuable or compelling nature.
Yeah.
So what happens is, this kind of obsession with things of non-consequence got to be the point where people followed them simply because there was a kind of a path to it, but at the same time, there was nothing compelling about the
Mhm.
individual search. And it kind of became like the Goldstein syndrome, where
Yeah.
basically, in fact, Sabine Hassenfelder talks about this in terms of her book about, like, the
She is
facility,
fascinating.
the
Yeah.
facilities of math that
Mhm.
basically kind of became its own obsession. So you
Mhm.
kind of create this kind of, singular obsession, which really you lack the self-reflection to look at
Mhm.
and realize, hey, it's just me spinning my own ego,
Yeah.
and it really has no consequence.
And
So anyway,
and is the nature of beauty in the labyrinth, is it those fern protein entities who inhabit it and have built it into something more like a palace or a city state? Is it the
well, what
labyrinth
about the idea?
itself?
What about
Yeah.
the idea? The fact that, like, you
Mhm.
have something like lateral gene transfer, where you can actually
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
these things and construct your own, kind of genetic code.
Yeah.
So that the idea that we think about the fact that, not that we kind of don't have natural selection, or kind of like, that doesn't maybe happen in kind of the larger organisms. We do understand that the smaller organisms, and even some of the larger organisms, are capable of their own mutations, and it's not just
Yes.
a question of, like, this kind of like gradual or kind of like, mutation thing leading us in the sense of entanglement. But
Mhm.
the idea is that you can actually design
Mhm.
your own circumstance out of necessity. And I think,
Mhm.
Lynn Margulis in Symbiogenesis,
Mhm.
I think made a really good point
Mhm.
about the fact that this is the way, in fact, that
Mhm.
things exist. And though it's still a contended theory, I think it's starting to become a more regularly recognized thing within kind of evolutionary biology, and in, like, the theoretical aspects of kind of like, evolution and biology. So, I mean, I kind of like
True.
think that, and in fact, it was also something that John Dupre, even
Mhm.
though he didn't mention her, it seemed as if
Mhm.
the principle was at least
Yeah.
in some of his lectures.
And finally,
Say,
is the beauty in Nabucco, is I believe it's his potential for transformation. In the opera, his character transforms dramatically
mhm,
through the machinations of, I believe, his
mhm.
stepdaughter, and he is here observing the fern proteins who can progress, have evolved quite rapidly and phenomenally. Is it possible that he now examines his own motivations, his own interior life? Is that a transformation that promotes a future model of beauty within the character of Nabucco? I believe, yes, it is. In fact, his entire cloak is macro scaled to micro scaled ferns, coiled right down to fern proteins. So
As a robe.
yes, he is being rewritten like horizontal gene transfer does by his contact
Huh.
with fern
Is he
proteins.
aware of it? Is he aware of it here?
I'm
No, again, like
sure
honestly, that's
that
the thing.
he-
No,
yeah.
that's what I love about this. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
you
don't-
know, one of
yeah.
the things that I know I love about opera, and I know you've talked about,
Mhm.
is the fact that, like, you know, you kind of have this constant interpretation,
Yeah.
and you kind of like look at the subtlety, the nuance,
Mhm.
the history, the idea. I mean, and that's why we kind of like really get annoyed when people do these insipid things where
Oh,
they
we
just kind
have
of
to say that.
oversimplified and totally take out all the character and do something
And the
like,
setting and
oh,
the time
and
and the place,
they
and
make
they
up these
stick
settings.
an iron staircase in
Oh,
the middle of the stage, and there's
Jesus
nothing
fucking
else
Christ.
there.
It's like, oh, let's do,
It
you know,
sucks
Salome
all
in
the-
a subway station, or like, let's do it in a Newark. I'm like, oh God. You know, it's like this just idea from like this kind of,
I'll never ever forget the final scene of La Forza del
oh
Destino
God, that was so
set
tragic.
with homeless people in garbage in a Seattle bus
Oh,
station
my
at the
God.
Met. It totally killed the
It had
music. It killed the
absolutely-
mood. Nothing to do with it. Took all of the nobility out of it. It sucked the
Right.
grandeur out
And
of
it was also, like, I look at it
dreadful.
this way: the
Dreadful.
setting is important
It's
in order
vital.
to tell the story. And what was amazing
Yeah.
was the death scene was completely obscured because
Yeah.
of this complete ridiculous setting.
Yeah,
And it's
the
like the
set was
setting was so
dreadful.
dreadful that we hadn't, we kind of like almost, we didn't have the death scene.
It was hard to see the death scene
Right.
through a chain link fence.
Right. And you kind of
It
like
was
had to go like,
ridiculous.
wait a minute.
It
Like,
totally
we know
ruined
the
it.
story.
Yeah.
That's not the story. It's kind of like, you know, honestly, finding ways to look deeper is very, very vital.
But these don't.
But by doing things just to kind of appear provocative and then obscuring the real meaning,
It
that's a
trivializes it.
exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And again,
Yeah.
we don't have the same educated audience we used
Yeah,
to have, so
hardly.
they have no idea what the fuck they're looking at.
No. And in fact, moved no one. In fact, it made people giggle. I mean,
It was
you know,
so insipid.
anyway.
But
I
again,
don't
like
take
what
a lot
happens
of
is
time
when
with that.
your techniques, and there was a lot of,
Thank you,
there was
Pete.
some CGI in there,
Oh,
and they
it was
had some
ridiculous.
anime
Then
stuff.
they had
and
a car crash,
Oh,
which is
God.
just absurd.
you know.
Anyway.
Well, the car
thank
crash
you
was
for
part of
having
it.
me.
You know. Oh, it's always
Thank you
this
for
week in
having
June.
me.
Bye, P.
Bye, Pete.
Well, I'll actually come back and sit, and we'll talk about the rest. But put the painting down, because actually, I think that
Yeah.
this idea of kind of like having a theme that you kind of show a piece that has something to do with consequence with what we're talking about makes a tremendous amount of sense. Now, one of the things that I always did in my work until recently, and because of you, was, for me, I was always interested and obsessed with truth.
Mhm.
I always felt that honesty and truth were really the thing that kind of like led you to investigation. And I guess that kind of stems from the fact that I always believed in, Leonardo, in the fact that one needed to understand before one judged, and that understanding was the key to any kind of real operation of anything. And that you almost kind of to the point where it became obsessive with Leonardo, where he felt like until he had enough understanding, he couldn't operate at all, which I think kind of stumbled him in his life. And I think it's
Sure.
kind of done that. I can understand that in my own work, in the fact that sometimes it's kind of obsessed me to the point where I'm thinking, oh, I'm not ready. But I've known people who've had a greater obsession with that than me. And I saw how it's like became quite insipid. So I was like, now so I remember I think it's the Nike commercial, like just draw, just do it. So I remember I was at the AA. I was there at the AA in London, and I was kind of like, and I remember, I think it was on a panel discussion there when I was coming back from Moscow. And I just remember kind of like a lot of telling students, like I tell my students in the United States, just do it. Because there was this obsession as architecture was becoming very anal and very constipated of like, oh, what if I did this? And what if I did that? And what if I did the other? It's like, just do it. Once you do it, we can see, what the operational potential is. But I mean, this idea that you kind of might find the perfect thing or it's just inconsequential. And it was so incredibly like regressive and kind of like just constipated and anal. And it was just, oh God, I think that was part of the nature of the profession. And it's only gotten worse, but I just felt like, just do it. Look, what do you got to lose? Like if it sucks, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour or two, just get it out of the fucking way. Get to draw. Just sit down and fucking draw. So anyway, so what I found was that, that obsession with the truth was such that I didn't understand that, being someone who was as devoted to Leonardo as I thought I was, I missed the fact that the real significance was the fact that beauty was something that he appreciated, and that the understanding of beauty was just as important as the understanding of truth. And I didn't really understand Leonardo until I read Whitehead, who of course never knew Leonardo because they're like 500 years apart. But the point is 400 years apart. But the point is that idea of accretion, like we talked about in terms of the metaphor, in terms of entanglement, in terms of the metaphor, leads us to a situation where things move us in a certain direction. And we check ourselves and we kind of find ways like unbreakable bonds to be able to kind of see how we're doing in terms of moving ourselves in that place. And for Whitehead, adventure is predicated on the idea of civilization being occasioned by beauty and truth, not just in themselves, but in their drama between each other. And he actually makes a point of saying that beauty is more important, and the fact that the truth only has consequences, beauty is present. Now, to me, that makes a lot of sense, because I think the component of beauty is the projection of potential as opposed to simply an understanding of what is. So, there's an intense pleasure or satisfaction to the mind. And that I think is the circumstance of that, is the fact that truth is basically an understanding and appreciation of the relationship of your observations creating a pattern that has a kind of like consistency with appearance. And beauty is the thing that gives its consequence, because it kind of basically bears it into something that has a significance. So I came to understand the fact that like there were truths that were insignificant, but there was no insignificant beauty. Beauty was a much greater complexity in the fact that there were overlapping networks of beauty that could sometimes make these things obscure and entangled, and therefore kind of like appearing to be paradoxical. But in fact, what has to happen is you have to basically understand it as a process, right? Not as a static thing. And that when you kind of look at it and you kind of can tease your way through it, it makes sense. And it is not in conflict. It's just that what happens is the incredible intricacy of the perspective makes it such that it can seem paradoxical, can seem antithetical, can actually seem in conflict. But it only happens that because of the limited perspective. We'll talk about perspective when we talk about the nature of perspective within the metaphor. But for now, we'll basically kind of keep ourselves contained to this, which is in the case of beauty. So I came, because of my understanding of the depth of the work of Julie, that I thought you were coming back. Because of that, I realized that I had.
I'm gonna take it from here. Sorry.
Yeah, that was that. Like, I said, like, there's
eat my final chocolate.
Oh, good.
I can share it with you.
Oh no, I had mine. So, I think because of that factor of that, that you kind of came to understand and operated in that situation where I felt like I kind of got stumbled by the fact that like. It's important to understand, and understanding was simply understanding truth. But no, like understanding also had a component.
Good night.
No.
There we share. Okay.
Of the potential, rather than simply what was. I mean, if I was to look at biological things, and we look at kind of like those things that come before the lineage,
right,
that would be truth. But if we look at the clade, that would be beauty, in the fact that there's the potential, right? So the truth has within it a potential that may or may not be true, but basically hasn't been seen yet.
Really
Yeah, sure. May or may not be seen yet, but basically exists as a potential, as a speculation. So, and the adventure is what allows you to kind of like live this life that you kind of like, oh, you want another one?
Yeah, sure. I'm so
Okay.
tired.
Oh, Pete, how are you going to paint tonight?
Well, yeah, I definitely want to paint.
Because we want to finish that piece.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Pete.
And then we can talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm. Oh, thank you, Pete.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's an interesting question.
Mm.
Is there more beauty in a potential that we might be imagining for a person or an entity which would need a buttress of character that they may not possess? Or is a kind of self-kindled beauty based on the person's actual past and present more beautiful if they come to that transformation on their own, meaning intrinsically versus extrinsic forces? Meaning there were a lot of extrinsic forces at work on Nabucco. His character would never have changed if he were just left to his own devices, and he simply took control and schemed and, basically, went, followed the trajectory that had been historically his. But a lot of external forces came and transformed him beyond his capability to really understand what was going on. I think that's even more beautiful because it's very unexpected, it's very unpredictable, and it allows for a metaphorical transformation because the metaphor is very unpredictable.
Yes, in fact, one of the things that was interesting goes back to the idea of the fact that, like, the metaphor is not foreseeable, which is basically kind of its energy. Is the
That's
fact
what
that
I mean. It's far more beautiful.
It's
that's interesting.
It's an intuition.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically a creative process.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the thing about the metaphor is it creates potential for entanglement,
Mm-hmm.
and it's unforeseeable until it actually happens. Because the thing is, it's not, I mean, you can pair any series of concepts or any two concepts. And I mean, a lot of times we just think in terms of like two or a series of concepts. But the point is how you pair them and in what circumstance you pair them. These are unforeseeable. Maybe that's the reason. Because I've always if you take like a logical series of axioms, the outcomes are foreseeable in the pieces that you use. However, that doesn't happen with the metaphor. And I've always felt that that was the reason why it had an intricate complexity that was beyond human comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
So I do believe that. And I do believe that that's the kind of thing that allows for the transformation or the transfiguration of the concepts. But the concepts actually get altered by the entanglement, which is something I'll talk about when I talk about entanglements and conditioning. Because what happens is the entanglement action actually conditions not just the concepts, but the context. So I think that's an important thing to understand. So in a way, I think that Ortega didn't understand the fact that there was a tremendous amount of depth and complexity to his idea of perspective and his idea of the drama. It's just that I don't think he had the kind of scientific background like Whitehead did. So I do see a parallel to be able to see that as process, right? Because he still was kind of stuck in the kind of like, neo-Kantian idealist state, with like, the Marburg School and stuff like that. Was it Marburg? I think it was like, I think it was the Marburg School. Anyway, but he was like with some of those neo-Kantians. But I think that was what kind of held him back. Whereas I think for Whitehead, he was able to kind of see through that to understand the fact that it's a kind of series of networks. And that's why I kind of look at the, things in organic world as an integration of processes, not a collection of parts. The thing is, we think that we can just, like in a machine, you can just take this bolt out, take that out, and put a different manifold in. The problem is, like, an organic an organism is different than a mechanism.
Mhm.
And ultimately, an organic architecture will be maybe either, I mean, to approach it, you have to approach it either as a series of overlapping organic processes, which is
Mhm.
what nature is, or you can kind of basically kind of do like a strangler fig, where you
Mhm.
kind of take like an artificial apparatus and you
Mhm.
allow something to consume that and create its own
Mhm.
entity, which would be, maybe we should do. I mean, because I don't say
Mhm.
nobody has a clue how to do an organic architecture. And
No.
we've talked about it, but it's like no one has a clue. And there are people who are, I mean, I don't either, but at least I'm kind of admitting the fact that, like, I can see the fact that maybe the process of thinking is the way that's kind of stumbling us. But
Yes,
anyway,
but you can see the plane laid out before you. They can't. It's a
maybe.
very big difference.
I think that is. I think it is. And I think that's
They
because,
don't
like,
see any plane.
I think it's because I draw.
Oh,
You know, I think
well,
because I draw,
drawing
I
is the
kind of
root
like,
of
I think it
everything.
allows me to kind of like visualize in a way that kind
Mhm.
of isn't kind of static. In fact, that was the one thing that was interesting about Ahu's jury was the
Mhm.
fact that, like, you know, she's trying to do this thing where she's trying to get people to understand the capacity within their tools
Mhm.
rather than their kind of very narrow focus in terms of the projects that they
Mhm.
apply it to.
Mhm.
And in fact, one of the things I found interesting was the people who were more architectural
Mhm.
were incapable of seeing some of the beauty and nuance and complexity and intricacy of what some of the students had done, because the students aren't as predisposed to that
Mhm.
kind of like limited thinking. And I think it was interesting was that there was a lot of intricacy that people without the kind of like predisposed thinking towards things could already overcome, where some of the older people, though more professional, were really stuck. But anyway, so because of you, my loved one,
Thanks,
I came
Pete.
to understand and appreciate the fact that I was lacking the fact that part of that concept of
Mhm.
beauty, right, was missing. And I think what's interesting is we still in our world have
Mhm.
very poor definitions of beauty and
Quiet.
truth,
Yeah,
right?
I
In
agree.
fact, when it's funny, if you look up, like, you know,
It defines it by itself.
yeah,
The
exactly. It's
definitions
because they
are
really don't know.
very
So we're
poor.
aware of the fact
No.
that there are these things, you know, that could exist, as we know that the truth has a consequence, because it basically allows us to refer back to other things and basically test that as a result of the fact that, yes, this basically has a simultaneity. So the idea of truth as not existing is just kind of silly. But in terms of beauty, beauty is also a very poorly defined word. And in fact, what was interesting was, like, you know,
Mhm.
in terms of like what Whitehead talked about it, he really kind
Mhm.
of fleshed it out in terms of its complexity in
Mhm.
relationship to truth. But at the same time, you know, he talked about it as a precipitate for civilization.
Mhm.
And that was the kind of thing that was really most important. But this thing is, it's still it comes back to a kind of harmonious relationship. You know, yeah,
Let's I
say.
say something. I think that real beauty is combinatorial. And by that I mean people who define beauty by itself, and most of the dictionary definitions are self defining, which is a terrible way to
Mm,
undefine anything because people have lost the capacity to use original words to define known concepts.
mm,
And I think that's really key. So people will often judge what beauty is as one ingredient. I mean, a very, very isolationist approach to what beauty is. But it's a little bit
oh,
distracting.
sorry, P.
Sorry. And it's going to make weird noises on your tape,
I mean,
too. But I'm just saying
mm,
that the beauty is in the complexity of the recipe, not just single ingredients. Yes, you can
yes,
have
exactly.
fascinating
The integration of
ingredients.
processes.
It's
Yeah, it's
combinatorial.
exactly. So
Yeah.
the integration of different things. I mean, what happens is, and Whitehead talks about this, is that, and it's that idea of homeoresis, that it's not just simply like the difference between homeostasis and homeoresis is that
Mhm.
homeostasis is basically understanding a state that's fixed. And in a process, you don't really have things that are stable. They have stable moments, but they're also part of a trajectory,
Mhm.
which means that, like, a tree basically
Mhm.
becomes a fallen tree, which doesn't cease to exist, right? It's not a tree in the fact that it'll give leaves, right? But what happens is it becomes like almost like a coral reef in the fact that it becomes this kind of harbor of other kinds of life. So, you know, that idea of kind of like the process by which something exists in series of occasions is, and I don't want to use too much of the language because it kind of, you know, Whitehead language is kind of like its own thing, and I want to try to keep it within the context. His language is incredibly highly specific, you know, and I want to stay away from that because, again, I'm not a Whitehead scholar. So anyway, beauty had that sense that it was supreme, and it was, you know, something that I think is something that really is at the essence of a life of civility.
Yeah.
And civility is that life that moves us towards a greater depth of understanding and appreciation of things.
Something we all don't have right now.
It's true. I mean, you know, one at a time, I mean, we talk about this a lot in the fact that we feel as if we're keeping alive traditions, kind of like in the sense of Diderot and Voltaire, that, you know, if we don't keep these things alive, they will disappear. And I do see a lot of things that have disappeared already. And it's a kind of it's like being the last mandarins, you know, you just feel as if like, you know, at this point, unless there's something that takes this on, which is another reason why, you know, these kind of videos made in the middle of the night on a Sunday morning, you know, are kind of like, hey, you know what, you put it out there, just like, you know, somebody maybe, you know, exactly. But the point is maybe somebody kind of sees it and says, oh, wait a minute, this might be important or whatever. But, you know,
or they're smart enough to know this is a vital important
maybe. But at the very least, you know, we believe that there's a sense of things that are kind of slipping away of consequence. In fact, one of the things we have to do now to think about it is we talked about the death of 2D design and how that was a significant component. We should have
a whole show on
We should do that. You know, the death of 2D design. Because honestly, that was something that basically kind of was, you know, a basis by which people understand basic organization. Organization and order were the things that allow things to kind of like make sense. You can break any apparatus into its orders, into its patterns, into its systems.
Of information is critical to the functioning of a society.
And understanding simple organizational principles is essential. And doing it on a two-dimensional surface is the beginning, you know,
and
then you do
it in a beautiful way.
Yes, exactly. So doing it on a 2D surface before you can do it on a 3D surface, that was a thing that, like, it's like sometimes you don't notice what you've lost and then you don't understand why you're missing something as vital. And I think that's the thing that I see, you know, almost like that Borges piece, where it's like what dies with each individual person. You know, sometimes things are left that are insignificant, sometimes things are lost that are important. I mean, there's always the story about the fact that they felt that, like, if you know, they took a picture of all the famous physicists, I think, you know, they had like, you know, they had Einstein and they had Planck and they had all these people, and like Marie Curie was there, and they said, if we lost all these people right now, it might set us back hundreds of years.
Probably. Oh my God, have we been on for
well, that's because, I guess so. So anyway, let's sign off. So next week, we're going to be talking about, that'll be episode 26, and that is love. Well, that's because love is the correlate of truth and beauty, and that comes from Ortega. But anyway, let's just say that this has been fun, and I think we're going to have to have my loved one on as a general component.
I can do cameos.
And then after that, we'll do entanglement and conditioning, measurement, and the nature of perspective within the metaphor. So this has been The Realm of Ideas, and I will close with The Realm of Ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.